Reminder that this program contains racist language that some viewers may find offensive.
Now, the people whom I've characterized as members of a new colony would probably be described by most of you as immigrants. You'll notice, by the way, that I've pinched one of Mrs. Thatcher's strategies, and the you to whom I'm talking is a white you. So now I'd like to ask to think about this word immigrant, because it seems to me to demonstrate the extent to which racist concepts have been allowed to seize the central ground and to shape the whole nature of the debate. The facts are that for many years now, there has been a sizable amount of white immigration as well as black, that the annual number of emigrants leaving these shores is now larger than the number of immigrants coming in, and that, of the black communities, over 40% are not immigrants, but black Britons, born and bred, speaking in the many voices and accents of Britain, and with no homeland but this one. And still, the word immigrant means black immigrant. The myth of swamping lingers on, and even British-born blacks and Asians are thought of as people whose real home is elsewhere. Immigration is only a problem if you are worried about blacks. That is, if your whole approach to the question is one of racial prejudice. But perhaps the worst thing about the so-called numbers game is its assumption that less black immigration is self-evidently desirable. The effect of this assumption is that governments of both parties have eagerly passed off gross injustice as success. Let me explain. The immigration laws of this country have established a quota system for the migration of UK passport holders from various countries. But ever since Idi Amin drove out the Uganda nations, and Britain did her best to prevent those British citizens from entering this country, that African quota has remained, every year, unfilled. The reason is that the fleeing Asians, having been spurned by Britain, were given refuge by India. But the Indian quota was never increased, and as a result, the total number of black immigrants to Britain has fallen. Now, you might think that natural justice would demand that the already lamentably low quotas for British citizens from Africa would be made available to those same citizens now living as refugees in a desperately poor country which can ill afford to care for them. But natural justice has never been much in evidence in this field. In fact, the British tax system now intends to withhold tax relief from wage earners here whose dependents are trapped abroad. So first you keep people's families away from them, and then you alter your laws to make it twice as hard for those people to keep their families fed. They're only immigrants, after all. A couple of years ago, the British press made a huge stink about a family of African Asians who arrived at Heathrow Airport and were housed by the very reluctant local authority. It became a classic media witch hunt. They come over here, sponge off the state, and jump the housing queue. But that same week, another family also landed at Heathrow, also needing and getting housing from the same local authority. This second family barely made the papers. It was a family of white Rhodesians running away from the prospect of a free Zimbabwe. One of the more curious aspects of British immigration law is that many Rhodesians, South Africans, and other white non-Britons have automatic right of entry and residence here by virtue of having one British-born grandparent, whereas many British citizens are denied these rights because they happen to be black. One last point about the immigrants. It's a pretty obvious point, but it keeps getting forgotten. It's this: they came because they were invited. The Macmillan government embarked on a large-scale advertising campaign to attract them. They were extraordinary advertisements, full of hope and optimism, which made Britain out to be a land of plenty, a golden opportunity not to be missed. And they worked. People travelled here in good faith, believing themselves wanted. This is how the new empire was imported. This country was named Perfidious Albion long ago, and that shaming nickname is now being earned all over again. So what's it like, this country to which the immigrants came and in which their children are growing up? You wouldn't recognize it, because this isn't the England of fair play, tolerance, decence, and equality. Maybe that place never existed anyway, except in fairy tales. In the streets of the new empire, black women are abused. Black children are beaten up on their way home from school. In the run-down housing estates of the new empire, black families have their windows broken. They're afraid to go out after dark, and human and animal excrement arrives through their letterboxes. The police offer threats instead of protection, and the courts offer small hope of redress. Britain is now two entirely different worlds, and the one you inhabit is determined by the color of your skin. Now, in my experience, very few white people, except for those active in fighting racism, are willing to believe the descriptions of contemporary reality offered by blacks. And black people, faced with what Professor Michael Dummett has called the will not to know, a chosen ignorance, not the ignorance of innocence, grow increasingly suspicious and angry. What's been created is a gulf in reality. White and black perceptions of everyday life have moved so far apart as to be incompatible. And the rift isn't narrowing, it's getting wider. We stand on opposite sides of an abyss, yelling at each other and sometimes hurling stones, while the ground crumbles beneath our feet. I make no apology for taking an uncompromising view of the reasons for the existence of this chasm. I blame you. The will to ignorance, of which Professor Dummett speaks, arises out of your desire not to face the consequences of what's going on. Because if you allowed yourselves to know, you'd have to alter your picture of the world far too radically for your liking. Now, you don't want to do that. It's uncomfortable. It's difficult. So you close your ears. But you might do well to remember that those who adopt the position of the ostrich invite a swift kick in the pants. The fact is that every major institution in this country is permeated by racial prejudice to some degree, and the unwillingness of the white majority to recognize this is the main reason why it can remain the case. Let's take the law. We have in Britain today judges like Mackinnon who can say in court that the word nigger cannot be considered an epithet of racial abuse because he was nicknamed nigger at his public school. Or like the great Lord Denning, who can publish a book claiming that black people aren't as fitted as whites to serve on juries because they come from cultures with less stringent moral codes. We've got a police force that harasses blacks every day of their lives. There was a policeman who sat in an unmarked car on Railton Road in Brixton last year, shouting abuse at passing black kids and arresting the first youngsters who made the mistake of answering back. There were policemen at a Southall demonstration who sat in their vans writing the letters NF in the steam of their breath on the windows. The British police have even refused to make racial discrimination an offence in their code of conduct, in spite of Lord Scarman's recommendations. Now, it's precisely because the law courts and the police are not doing their jobs that the activities of racist hooligans are on the increase. It's just not good enough, you see, to deplore the existence of neo-fascists in your society. They exist because they are permitted to exist. I said every major institution, so let's consider the government itself. When the Race Relations Act was passed, the government of Britain specifically exempted itself and all its actions from the jurisdiction of the Act. So you see, the evidence of institutional racism is so voluminous that I can't hope to do more than provide a few examples. But if you choose to believe that these are untypical, that I'm distorting reality to suit my arguments, then I'm afraid that you'll have joined the monstrous regiment of ostriches. A friend of mine, an Indian, was deported recently for the technical offence known as overstaying. This means that after a dozen or so years of living here, he was found to be a couple of days late sending in the forms applying for an extension to his stay. Now, neither he nor his family had ever claimed a penny in welfare, or I suppose I should say been in trouble with the police. He and his wife financed themselves by running a clothes stall, and they gave all their spare time and effort to voluntary work helping their community. My friend was chairman of his local traders association. So when the deportation order was made, this association, all 3 of his borough MPs, and about 50 other MPs of all parties pleaded with the Home Office for clemency. None was forthcoming. My friend's son had a rare disease, and a doctor's report was produced stating that the child's health would be endangered if he was sent to India. The Home Office replied that it considered there were no compassionate grounds for reversing its decision. In the end, my friend offered to leave voluntarily. He'd been offered sanctuary in Germany, and he asked to be allowed to go freely, to avoid the stigma of having a deportation order stamped into his passport. The Home Office refused him this last scrap of his self-respect and threw him out. As the fascist John Kingsley Reid once said, "One down, a million to go." The combination of this sort of institutional racism and the willed ignorance of the public was clearly in evidence during the passage through Parliament of the Nationality Act of 1981. This already notorious piece of legislation, expressly designed to deprive black and Asian Britons of their citizenship rights, went through in spite of some, mainly non-white, protest. And because it didn't really affect the position of the whites, you probably didn't even realize that one of your most ancient rights, a right you had possessed for 900 years, was being stolen from you. This was the right to citizenship by virtue of birth, the jus soli, or right of the soil. For 9 centuries, any child born on British soil was British, automatically, by right, not by permission of the state. The Nationality Act abolished the jus soli. From now on, citizenship is in the gift of the government. You were blind, because you believed the act was aimed at the blacks, and so you sat back and did nothing as Mrs. Thatcher stole the birthright of every one of us, black and white, and of our children and grandchildren forever. Now, it's possible that this blindness is incurable. One of the SDP's better-known candidates told me recently that while he found the idea of working-class racism easy to accept, the parallel notion of widespread prejudice in the middle classes was unconvincing to him. Yet after many years of voluntary work in this field, I know that the management levels of British industry and business are just as shot through by the threads of prejudice as are many unions. It's believed, for instance, that as many as 50% of all telephone calls made by employers to employment agencies specify no blacks. Black unemployment is much, much higher than white, and such anomalies don't arise by accident. Let me make my point by talking about television. I once earned my living writing commercials, and I found the prejudice of senior executives in British industry quite appalling. I could tell you the name of the chairman of a leading building society who rejected a jingle on the grounds that the off-screen singer sounded as if he had a black voice. The irony was that the singer was actually white, but the previous year's jingle had been sung by a black man who obviously had the good fortune not to sound like one. I know the marketing director of a leading confectionery firm who turned down all requests to cast a black child as one of an otherwise white group of children in his commercial. He said his research showed that such casting would be counterproductive. I know an airline advertising manager who refused to permit the use in his TV ads of a genuine air stewardess employed by his own airline because she was black. She was good enough to serve his customers their drinks, but not good enough so on television. Nor is this kind of prejudice confined to the commercial break. The New Statesman of November the 5th carried an article by Amon Sabah Sakana about Channel 4. It contained the following interesting passage about the commissioning of a £500,000 series of films about African history. The commissioning editor said that her approach was that no single black historian should be given the job of making such a program. Yet Basil Davidson, a white man, was precisely a single white historian given the financial backing and a white crew to make a non-racist series about black people. Fancy that. The history of white attitudes to blacks is one of a series of inadequate responses, of which Channel 4 may yet prove to be the latest. The nature of this inadequacy is well reflected by the English language itself. You can't escape the truth that a language reveals the attitudes of the people who use and shape it. A whole declension of patronizing terminology can be found in the language in which interracial relations have been described in Britain. At first, we were told, the goal was integration. Now, this word very rapidly came to mean assimilation. A black man could only become integrated when he started behaving like a white one. After integration came the concept of racial harmony. Now, once again, this sounded virtuous and desirable, but what it meant in practice was that blacks should live peaceably beside whites in spite of all the injustices done to them every day. The call for racial harmony was simply an invitation to shut up and smile while nothing was done about our grievances. And now there's a new catchword, multiculturalism. In our schools, this means little more than teaching the kids a few bongo rhythms, how to tie a sari and so forth. In the police training program, it means telling cadets that black people are so culturally different that they can't help making trouble. Multiculturalism is the latest token gesture towards Britain's blacks, and it ought to be exposed, like integration and racial harmony, for the sham it is. Meanwhile, the stereotyping goes on. Blacks have rhythm. Asians work hard. I've been told by Tory politicians that the Conservative Party seriously discusses the idea of wooing the Asians and leaving the Afro-Caribbeans to the Labour Party because Asians are such good capitalists. In the new empire, as in the old one, it seems our masters are willing to use the tried and trusted strategies of divide and rule. But I've saved the worst and most insidious stereotype for last. It is the characterization of black people as a problem. You talk about the race problem, the immigration problem, all sorts of problems. If you're a liberal, you say that black people have problems. If you aren't, you say they are the problem. But the members of the new colony have only one real problem, and that problem is white people. Racism, of course, is not our problem, it's yours. We simply suffer from the effects of your problem. And until you, the whites, see that the issue is not integration, or harmony, or multiculturalism, or immigration, but simply the business of facing up to and eradicating the prejudices within almost all of you, the citizens of your new and last empire will be obliged to struggle against you. You could say that we are required to embark on a new freedom movement. And so it's interesting to remember that when Mahatma Gandhi, the father of an earlier freedom movement, came to England and was asked what he thought of English civilization, he replied, "I think it would be a good idea."
More from our archives on Saturday with a groundbreaking open-ended discussion programme hosted by the late Anthony H. Wilson, After Dark, Saturday at 1:10. Next, investigating the Mother Teresa myth, Without Walls.